Tekla Structures Masonry Tools. Lesson 3, Masonry Tool Basics, Part 3. Topics in Lesson 3 include exploring the use of the CMU corner connection tool, adjusting the height of our walls, utilizing the CMU wall swap handles tool, and placing openings with the CMU wall opening tool, specifically discussing the tool's features and capabilities, as well as demonstrating the use of the CMU wall update tool. In this portion of Lesson 3, we're going to take a quick look at the corner connection tool. To do so, we're going to place a couple of walls in the interior of our structure. We'll do this along grid line 2 and grid line C as shown on screen, and we'll specifically use the tool at the intersection of grid lines 2 and C. We'll adjust the connections along E line and 3 line as we have been by adjusting the end conditions. So to begin, let's go ahead and open up the CMU wall tool. Let's drop down and load up our 8-inch wall preset that we've made and apply our settings. With the tool active, we're going to go ahead and create a wall along 2 line from E line to C line. We're going to use the endpoint of one of our Ys as our starting point and then come down and snap perpendicularly to C line. Then we're going to repeat this process and go to the right along C line. Make sure to snap perpendicularly. For the segment we've just placed, let's ensure to select the wall and then select its endpoint. Right-click and use the Move command to nudge that out about 6 or 7 inches so that we get the extension of the half blocks into the wall. Let's go ahead and move back to the walls on E line and let's adjust our end conditions and remove those half blocks from the start point. And it looks like our courses line up with the perpendicular wall, so let's move down to the intersection of grid line 2 and grid line C. And now we're going to go ahead and use the corner connection tool. You can go ahead and close the CMU wall tool, and then in the applications and components, let's double click on the CMU corner connection tool. This will bring up a simple dialog box with a single diagram that shows us the picking order in which we need to choose our walls. And the picking order is actually pretty important. What we need to do is we need to ensure that we are picking the wall with its start point not at the corner we are trying to connect, so furthest away. Then we will pick the second perpendicular wall. If we do it in the opposite order, we're not going to get the results that we need. So let's take a look at how that plays out. If we go ahead and select our interior walls, we can see the start and end points very easily. Start points are always in yellow, and midpoints and endpoints are always in magenta. So for the wall along 2 line, our start point is at E line going down to C. For the perpendicular wall, our start point is going to be at the intersection of C and 2 going to the right. So our vertical wall on 2 line is going to be our first click, and then we are going to select the perpendicular wall along C line. So let's go ahead and hit the Create button, then select the wall along 2 line, and then secondly the wall along C line. Now if we did this in the opposite direction, based on the way the grips are orientated, we would not have received this result. But you can see what the tool has done is it's gone ahead and it's adjusted for the walls, the end conditions, as well as the course configuration so that they interlock. Now that we've taken care of the corner, we can go to the wall along 3 line and remove the end conditions off the start of the second withe so that the perpendicular walls fit together. In this portion of Lesson 3, we have 2 tasks. First, to increase the wall height to 12 feet so that it can accommodate openings, and secondly, to eliminate the first 2 walls created with individual blocks and substitute it with walls created with the CMU wall tool. To begin, let's double-click on any wall segment to bring up the CMU wall dialog box. Next, let's go ahead and hold down Control and then click each one of the walls created with the CMU Wall tool. In the dialog box, let's uncheck every field and then update the wall height field to be 12 feet and check the checkbox next to it and then press Modify. Next, we're going to replace the 2 manual walls we created at the very beginning of Lesson 2 with walls using the CMU Wall tool. And the reason for this is twofold. One, we'd like to remain consistent throughout our structure, and secondly, the CMU Wall Opening tool actually requires a wall and not the individual blocks. In reality, it's far more quicker to replace these walls than it is to go ahead and manually add the openings and lintels using the CMU Block tool. However, you can create those openings using whole and half blocks using the same process we did to create these walls originally. To begin, let's go to our 3D view and then hit Ctrl-P to snap to plane. Let's do a crossing window from left to right to select the walls along A line, and then hold down Control to deselect any other perpendicular walls we've selected. Now if we zoom in, we can see that we've selected just the walls created with the manual blocks, and we can right-click and select Delete, or hit the Delete key on our keyboard. Next, what we can do is utilize our pre-existing CMU wall settings and apply that to create 2 new wall segments along A line. Let's go ahead and snap to plane in our 3D view, and we'll start at A and 3 and work our way from right to left. Now we're choosing to start at A3 as opposed to A1 for a very specific reason, and that is to highlight how to utilize the Swap Handles tool. So we're intentionally placing these 2 Ys from right to left as opposed to left to right so that we can use the Swap Handle tool to correct that and see how that process works. So once we've placed these, we'll go ahead and then swap them and adjust them to fit accordingly. Make sure to adjust your endpoints so that you can extend the wall the maximum length to interlock with the perpendicular walls, and adjust your end conditions as shown on screen so that we form the correct corners. This will allow for a more realistic condition when we use the Swap Handles tool. Here, let's go and adjust the end conditions for the width on grid line A between 1 and 2, as well as the end conditions for the width between grid lines 2 and 3. And lastly, let's also adjust its wall attributes or the course orientation so that the blocks line up with the perpendicular wall on grid line 3. Once you've adjusted the dialog box for the Ys, this is the result you'll be looking for. Now, what we can do is zoom in to our walls on grid line A, and we're going to select the wall, and then in the Applications and Components pane, we are going to go ahead and double click on the CMU Wall Swap Handles. This tool has no dialog box and will execute the task without any further input. Notice how the position of the wall changes, but the tool has gone and literally changed the positions of the start and end handles, so we will need to make some adjustments. In the future, if you find that you have modeled the wall in the incorrect direction, or that when you place your wall openings they come in the opposite direction which corresponds with the dialog box, you can swap the handles of the wall and then adjust the position and end conditions to align it back to the proper direction. Go ahead and adjust the Ys along grid line A and adjust the end conditions and positions as shown on screen. You may also need to adjust the wall by selecting it, right-clicking, and then hitting Move to align the blocks to the correct position along grid lines A and 1 as well as A and 3. Make sure to verify you still have the correct thickness for your seam along grid line 2. When completed, your wall along A line should look similar to what is shown. In this portion of the lesson, we'll be focusing on the Wall Opening tool and Wall Update tool, as they work in tandem together. The Wall Opening tool can be found in the Applications and Components side pane. To begin, let's double-click on the CMU Wall Opening icon and move to our wall along A line. Let's click the wall to select the wall we'd like to place the opening on, and let's choose our insertion point. Let's use the first course at the bottom, closest to A in 1. And we'll use the right side edge of the fourth block. Once we place the opening, you'll notice a few characteristics. First and foremost, we have not placed any half blocks, and then we do see outlines of the blocks that were cut to create the opening. This is normal and to be expected. If this is the result that you get, we can quickly rectify this by just updating the wall, and that's the purpose of the CMU Wall Update tool. It allows the wall to be refreshed so that the blocks appear as they are intended to be. We can select the wall and then double-click on CMU Wall Update icon. Notice at the bottom left, it will go through the number of walls in your model. So this process will vary in time as it does analyze all walls within the model. But once we do, you can see now half blocks have been added and our cut is rectangular in shape. And this is all derived from the dialog box that controls the wall opening tool. So let's go ahead and take a look on how that works. To open up the wall opening tool dialog box, we can double click on the opening we have placed in and of itself, or we can double click on the icon in the applications and components side pane. We have a few tabs for the wall opening tool, the open tab, the lintel tab, and then tabs for both the horizontal and tie reinforcement. As with most of the masonry tools, we have an image to control the configuration. It can be dropped down to select various points. The key thing here is to notice the insertion point from where you click and how the opening is actually placed. There's also variation in dimension and what those values will provide. First, let's go ahead and select the image in which places the insertion point at the bottom left corner as shown, and then hit modify. And notice how the opening adjusts. Now we can populate the values that correspond to the dimensions in the image to correspond to our opening. So let's add a door. First and foremost, let's make the width 3 foot 4 inches and 3/8, and the height 7 foot 3 and 5/8. And then once we hit modify, we have something that is more akin to a door opening. Now, the F dimension in this case will provide us with the height of an arc. If this is left at 0, we have a square rectangular opening. But if we provide the value of, say, 6 inches, notice that it provides the arc. We'll need to manually adjust the reinforcement associated with above the lintel, but you can see that you have the ability to create some rounding cuts with the opening tool. Let's go ahead and change that back to 0. Before moving on to the lintel tab, let's go ahead and ensure that our opening tab is populated as shown on screen. Ensure to select the opening and hit modify before proceeding. On the Lintel tab, we have quite a few options to control the lintels in and of themselves. First and foremost, up at the top, we have the ability to choose how we create the lintels and what that overlap is to either side. From the Create drop-down, we can choose None, Individual, or Full. Individual will place single blocks to form the lintel, where Full will try to place a continuous piece of masonry, similar to a precast lintel. For our demonstrations today, we are going to focus on the individual. And of course, if you don't want the tool to place the lintel for you, simply choose None. The diagram to the right of the Creation drop-down allows us to specify the overlap of the lintel to the left and to the right of the opening by specifying a specific distance. Below that, we can then provide the attributes for our lintel blocks. We can choose from the shape catalog and provide the material, a name, a class, the height of the block, and the grout thickness, as well as tagging those blocks for reinforcement and if we want to cut the opening's reinforcement around those lintels or not. And again, lastly, we also are able to provide a design name and group mark. This is all in line with the other masonry tools, such as the wall tool or the single block. Take notice to the right-hand side of the dialog box, where we have the section dedicated to customized tagging. This allows us to apply user-defined attributes tagged to the overall wall and/or opening, and we can then call upon them later as an information, such as in a drawing callout or reporting. So let's go ahead and start to populate our lintel tab and change the configuration of our opening. First, let's ensure that we're selecting the individual creation type. Next, we'll go ahead and then adjust our overlaps on either side of the opening. For the left, let's go ahead and populate 7 5/8 inch. And for the right, let's go ahead and do 1'3" and 1/4. Now I understand that dimension doesn't line up, but we'll see why in just a few. So now that we have those and we hit modify, we can see that the blocks align with the bond beam that we have previously placed. Let's go ahead and change that to 7 5/8, and we can see now it's going to drop in that half block on the right hand side. We'll undo that. Next, let's go ahead and select our block type and choose CMU 8x8x16-BB, the same block type that we've used for our bond beams. Next, we'll select our material and set it to C60. We'll go ahead and leave name at lintel, class at 21, and the height and grout we'll leave alone for right now. Next, we'll populate the design name with BBL, and then the design group mark with lint. For now, we'll leave customized tagging alone, and then once we have our settings applied, we can select our wall and hit modify. Now, as with the wall tool, we can turn on tagging, so let's go ahead and turn on block tagging. We can also go ahead and consider turning on cut rebar for lintel. Let's change it to yes, and then turn our wall transparent by hitting Shift 2, and then let's zoom in to see the difference on what happens when we change this field from yes to no. Notice the vertical reinforcement on the side of the opening. If we turn this cut rebar for lintel to yes, it's going to shorten that bar with the clear cover to underneath the lintel. If we leave it no, it'll extend on through. This way you have the ability to place the rebar at the length that is required. Now that we have adjusted some of the parameters for our lintel and opening, let's go ahead and take a look at the reinforcement that's been placed. To make things easier, let's go ahead and open up an elevated view. We'll go to the view ribbon and then to the view list and choose elevation on grid A. We can close the view dialog box and let's zoom in on our opening. This will give us a nice flush perspective. We can turn our blocks to wireframe by hitting Shift 1, and we can see easily the reinforcement that has been placed with the opening tool. We have the horizontal reinforcement placed in the lintels themselves, as well as the tie bars above the opening. First, let's take a look at the horizontal reinforcement. We have the ability to add horizontal reinforcement both above and below the opening, and we can control the name, size, material grade, bending radius, class, and so on in this top portion. To the bottom left, we can control the configuration of the horizontal reinforcement above the opening. And then to the right, we can do the same for below. It's similar to the reinforcement tabs in the CMU wall tool, which we can dictate a vertical clear distance from the bottom of the block, as seen here, as well as an extension past the opening for that dimension, and that can be controlled on either side independently. Lastly, from the drop down, we can choose either straight bar or with hooks and in which direction those hooks are placed. It's identical for the below portion of the dialog box, in which we would control that reinforcement the same way. It's important to mention that we don't necessarily need to place the horizontal reinforcement in the lintel in and of itself. In fact, what we could probably do is turn this off altogether and allow the horizontal reinforcement in the bond beam to act as the required steel above our opening. So if we change that to no, we'll notice we have no reinforcement. But if we go back to the Lintel tab, we can turn off or turn to no cut rebar for lintel, and that reinforcement is going to extend all the way through. That does mean the vertical reinforcement will do the same, so you'll have to make a choice on which configuration is most important and then manually update the rest of the reinforcement as needed. Since the reinforcement in the bond beam above our opening is adequate and we do not need to add any additional, let's go ahead and populate the horizontal reinforcement tab to not populate reinforcement either above or below the opening, as shown on screen. Ensure to select the opening and hit modify. Next, let's go ahead and take a look at the tie reinforcement tab. The top portion of the tie reinforcement will dictate the properties of the reinforcement to be placed above the opening. As you can see here, it reflects the same fields available to us in all the reinforcement that we've placed throughout the masonry tools, and should look familiar by now. One thing to note though is when creating tie or stirrup reinforcement, make sure to name it so it remains easily identifiable and quantifiable. Down to the bottom left, we have the ability to provide spacing for our ties or U-bars. First, we can provide how many spaces we would like, and then the space between the bars, center to center. Below that, you have the dimensions to extend the tie bars to either side of the opening, just like we did with the lintels. Then, to the right, we have the parameters that control the shape of the U-bar specifically. You can change each leg length independently and clear cover from the bottom and sides of the masonry units themselves. For the purposes of our demonstration, let's go ahead and populate the tie reinforcement tab as shown on screen. Ensure to select the opening and hit modify. Once completed, you should have tie bars at every 12 inches on center, extending 1 foot past either side of the opening. At this point, I'd like to take a moment to go back and look at the Lintel tab once more. There's some information on here we didn't touch on the first time around, and I want to highlight an issue. As you see on screen here, the lintel block to the right has not cut the bond beam fully, and the gap between the lintel and the bond beam seems to be extraordinarily large. What we can do is change the height shown on the Lintel tab to go ahead and adjust this. We can change the height to 8 inch. This will ensure that we're cutting the entire bond beam block out and replacing it with our lintel block. The other thing I'd like to highlight is the dimension of the extension of the lintel to the right of the opening. Originally, we placed 1 foot 3 inch and 1/4. This would provide us with a larger gap between the lintel and the bond beam block. Where normally we would have 3/8 of an inch, this is much greater. The purpose for this is to illustrate that you must be cognizant of the dimensions that you are placing inside the tool, and to ensure that those dimensions align with the overall block size and mortar spacing. As we can see here, we have a gap of 3/4 of an inch as opposed to 3/8. It's easily adjustable. We'll go back to the dialog box and then to the Lintel tab, and we'll adjust that from 1 foot 3 and 1/4 to 1 foot 3 and 5/8. And you can see now that the cut lines up with the edge of the bond beam block to the right. Now that we've discussed the various attributes on all the tabs for the wall opening tool, and the importance of using the CMU wall update tool when first placing our opening, let's go ahead and place a window to the right of our door. So on the opening tab, let's go ahead and populate the attributes as shown here on screen. And then let's go ahead and apply just those overall dimensions and execute by double-clicking on the CMU wall opening tool in the applications and components, selecting our wall, and then we're going to go ahead and place the wall's base point at the bottom of the 6th course, but aligned with the mortar gap from the 5th course, as shown on screen. From here, we can go ahead and make adjustments to our lintel. As we can see, it does not correspond with the blocks in the bond beam. Let's ensure to adjust the lintel configuration as shown on screen. Ensure to select the opening and hit modify. So, what we've accomplished is adding a second opening with a continuous lintel from the door to the window on both sides. As you can see, the CMU wall opening tool and wall update tool work in tandem to go ahead and provide easy control and configurations of the necessary requirements for openings in masonry walls. This concludes Lesson 3, Masonry Tool Basics, Part 3. Proceed to the next lesson, Lesson 4, Practical Application.